Welcome to this Breakaway Crochet tutorial. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use my Breakaway Crochet techniques to work these Millefleur mats. The free written pattern for this project is available for download in my Ravelry store. And in this video, I will focus on the specific concepts that might be hard to understand by reading the pattern alone. So let's have a closer look at what we will be making. The pattern sets out instructions to make the two sizes I'm showing here, but it's really easy to make these any size you want. And although it looks like the mats are made up of a bunch of individual little flowers, we are actually going to work all the flowers continuously in rows, as if doing a normal back and forth type of stitch, so you won't have to worry about any yarn tails or sewing. I should also emphasize that the final appearance of each mat depends a lot on getting all the little flowers to look as much alike as possible. The key to this is working very small floating rings and aiming for all of them to be of a consistent size. Since this pattern calls for fine thread and a very small hook, that can be a bit of a challenge. But the good news is that I'm also going to show you a hack that makes working the tiny floating rings with thin cotton thread much easier. But for now, I'll start with the traditional way of working the floating rings. And I'll be using a thicker yarn and bigger hook than the pattern calls for to help you see what I'm doing. Once you have your head around the basics, I'll let you in on the alternative technique that will help you make the very small floating rings that are required for this project. So let's start our foundation row of flowers, which will be along the bottom edge here. And we start by working from left to right, to establish the first row of flowers on the foundation row. So let's do our first stitch, which is actually a floating double crochet 2 together. And since this is a stitch based on double crochet, we start that off with a yarn over, just like we normally would to make a double crochet stitch. Now, let's make the floating ring. To do that, make another yarn over, pinch the yarn close to the hook, do another yarn over, and draw this new yarn in with what we're already pinching. So there we have 2 pinch loops. Finish the floating ring with another yarn over and pull through those 2 loops we're pinching. So these 2 small little loops here together form the floating ring, and that's where we will be working all the stitches for our little flower. It replaces a chain 4 slip stitch ring or magic circle that you might be traditionally using. Okay, so we are not finished with our floating double crochet 2 together. Let's do that now by using the loops that are already on the hook. Do a yarn over and pull through 2. And since this is a double crochet 2 together, we leave that first double crochet unfinished and start the second double crochet, another yarn over, and go through those 2 loops that we've made as the floating ring. Pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, and to finish this stitch, yarn over, pull through 3. So there we go. That is how we start every little flower in this mat. Floating double crochet 2 together. Continue with chain 3, slip stitch into the floating ring, chain 3, work a double crochet 2 together in the floating ring, that started the second petal. Finish it with a chain 3 and a slip stitch. And now we're just going to start the third petal with chain 3, double crochet 2 together. And that's as far as we're going for this very first flower. We're breaking away to the next one. It's going to sit right to the right of this one here. So again, we start with a floating double crochet 2 together. Again, that's yarn around for the first yarn over we need for the double crochet. Make the floating ring with a yarn over pinch, yarn over pinch, yarn over, pull through 2, make the floating ring, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, go through the floating ring, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 3. So that's started the next petal of the next flower. And continue again with chain 3, slip stitch, and the second petal again is chain 3, double crochet 2 together, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, double crochet 2 together. So that is basically the same for every flower that we want to start on our first row. So in this sample, I'll work a few more. Again, this is, you know, of course, where you can make the mat any size you want. I might just do a couple more just for this sample, and I'll join you once I've finished those. And now that I am at the end of my row, I've made as many flowers as I want to make the width of the mat. It's now time to come back the other direction and finish, for the most part, most of these little flowers off. So we're just going to come back around and finish each little flower and something slightly different at the end. But for now, just come back to the last flower we were working on. Let's finish this petal with chain 3, slip stitch, work another petal, chain 3, double crochet 2 together, chain 3, slip stitch, and now we just need to finish this first petal. Remember, that first petal is basically so far just the double crochet 2 together and chain 3. So we need to make the chain 3 that goes on the other side of that petal, and we close this little flower off by working a slip stitch between this flower and the next one. So you can see that little kind of dip there. We just work a slip stitch around that point, and that's finished off the last little flower here. Continue on the next flower in the same way. Just 3 more chains, slip stitch, work the next petal with the chain 3, double crochet 2 together, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, and finish with the slip stitch between. So you will continue with any other remaining flower until you get to the last one here. So I'll go ahead and finish this one off. And now that I'm on the last flower of this row, I'm only going to, again, partially work this flower because we need to arrange things so that we can go up to the next row. So for this flower, just finish it for now with chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, double crochet 2 together. There we go. And now it's time to start a joined foundation row. So that's the next row we will be working along, but this time we will need to be joining in the flowers together as we work along the row. So from now on, when we start a joined foundation row, we start with our floating double crochet 2 together, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, and double crochet 2 together. And this is now the breakaway point for the very first flower in this row. We're only going to work, I guess you'd say just like a quarter of the way around, because now this petal connects to the first petal of this flower. So that's why we break away here. All right, so start the next flower just like before. So it might be a little bit hard to see here, but I've started that first petal just like we always do. I've started the second petal with the chain 3, double crochet 2 together, and now we have reached a joining point. We need to join the tip of this flower down to the tip of the flower that's going to sit right underneath it. Okay, so I'm going to join those two together. The way I'm doing it in this project, and you might have done this before if you've done any sort of fine lace work, is to remove the loop or the hook from the loop, come down to where we're going to join, which will be this petal here. I like to come in from behind, just find whatever looks like the tip of the flower to you, and come through behind, come back up, join the working loop, and pull that through. Tighten that up if you need to, and that's join the two petals together. Normally I would do my slip stitch here, but I think it looks better in this project to do it this way. So that's what I'm calling a join. Let's finish this flower, and with chain 3, slip stitch, and start the third petal as usual with chain 3, double crochet 2 together. And that's the breakaway point for us to go to the next flower. So we've got 2 more flowers, and they are worked exactly like we've done the second one here. So I'll go ahead and finish that off. And now that we are at the end of this row, again, we just come back with a return row, just like we did on this first row, and finish off the first flowers, except for the very first one, with chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, double crochet 2 together, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, and a slip stitch between. So that establishes our basic pattern. So I'll continue that, and we finish again the last flower of the row with a chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, double crochet 2 together, ending with the north petal, so to speak, so that we can add another row. So actually I'm going to go ahead and finish off this row and do 2 more rows, and I'll meet you when I get to that point. And now that I'm happy with the number of rows, so I've finished with the return row here, it's time now to take care of the left hand edge, and that's basically the same as a return row. If you just flip it around, you can see it looks just like we're ready for a return row. So finish off these 3 flowers, and the last one just needs the chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, slip stitch, and that is the sample finished. So there we go, there's the left edge finished, and just orienting back to how it looked when we started. There's our sample finished. So let's get into the issue of the size of the floating rings. I wasn't taking too much care when I made this sample. You can see the floating rings are kind of big, which I guess doesn't look all that bad, but really more as an exercise and practice in getting the skill of making small floating rings with really thin thread. There's a technique we can use to help us do that. And the secret is using a stitch marker. Now some of you have already figured this out, and this is actually how I started making floating rings when I first invented this method. But I just got rid of it because I think it's quicker to work them without a stitch marker, but some of you may prefer it, and you can use a stitch marker for other projects as well, not just this one here, if that helps you in making a floating ring. So I'm just going to ignore that we're starting with a floating double crochet 2 together and just show you how to make a small floating ring. Alright, so just to make a very small floating ring, start with a yarn over, pick up your stitch marker, and pretend like this is a stitch in a project. And what we're going to do is go through the stitch marker, grab the yarn, and draw through a loop. Okay, so that's, if you think of this as a stitch and you're just drawing up a loop, that might be helpful. So that's how things look so far. And notice I'm tightening things up. And it's actually the, what would you call it, the thickness of the stitch marker that's going to determine the size of the loop. So I'm pulling quite tight. I mean, if you wanted a little bit looser, you could. But in this case, let's keep it fairly tight. Alright, so finish the floating ring with the yarn over and pull through 2. And since this is a practice, I've got an extra loop there, so don't worry about that. So that's the floating ring made with a stitch marker. Now to continue, sometimes you can just keep that stitch marker in and try to get through those 2 loops to make your next stitch, but in this case it's just going to be too tight. So I'd like you to remove the stitch marker, but make sure, you see how there's kind of that little figure of 8? You want to be looking at that, not that way around. You want that to be facing you. Hang on, pull that out, and there's our little tiny floating ring. And actually this floating ring is going to be too small for this hook. I've done that on purpose. Alright, so I'm not even going to try to go through there with this big hook. Let's see if we can do this again with our thread. So hopefully you can see this. I'm just going to start now, just review, making just a floating ring. I'm not worried about whatever stitch I'm trying to make. Just doing a floating ring with this very fine thread. So again, yarn over, pick up the stitch marker, go through, and pull through a loop. And it is going to be a little bit awkward because the stitch marker is stiff, not like yarn. Okay, so we're pulling that up fairly close. Yarn over, pull through 2. There's our floating ring made. Let's pull the stitch marker out and grab onto that little floating ring, and for whatever stitch we're going to do, it's once we get that first whatever we're doing through that little floating ring, it gets easier, like just like all rings. Okay, so let's try that again with actually our floating double crochet, how that would look. Okay, again, yarn over to make that first yarn over for the floating double crochet. Yarn over for that first yarn over of the floating ring. Go through the floating ring, draw a 3 loop. Yarn over, pull through 2. There's the floating ring made. Yarn over, pull through 2 to get that next pull through for the double crochet. And now let's get rid of the stitch marker. And this will be extremely fiddly, I agree, in the very beginning, but I promise it gets easier the more, as you get going and get more of your work to hang on to. All right, so continue with the yarn over. Go through our little tiny floating ring. Oops. Pull through 2. Yarn over, pull through 3, and there's our little tiny floating ring. So, it's kind of, either the same size as your hook, maybe slightly bigger, but hopefully that will help you make these little tiny floating rings. So I hope you enjoy learning a new skill, making the tiny floating rings that are incorporated into what's, pretty much a pretty simple motif to make, but it's a good way to practice something new and really getting your skills up to scratch. If you have any questions or concerned, please let me know, and let me see what you make. I hope you make some of these mats, and I would love to see what you come up with. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.